Hi, good evening. This is Dr. Randy Bach, or Dr. Randall S. Bach, MD, to you. Today is October 13, 2021, and I am here for yet another coronavirus conversation. The Facebook page is Viral Conversation. We certainly appreciate if you help it and like it and share it. I think we are going to have a very interesting show tonight. I'm going to try to clock in, about 45, 50 minutes or so. Um, pro tip, when I listen back to some of these, I put them on higher speeds. Maybe that's because I know what I'm going to say, but you know, these conversations, especially on the internet, can be pretty thick and dense. I'm hoping to bring some clarity to a complicated subject. There's a lot of talk going back and forth, kind of at each other without necessarily engaging. I'm going to try to do that. Somebody else has been trying to do that is a gentleman named Steve Kirsch. And how do you know he's somebody to pay attention to? Well, he's been shouted down, and he has had his Wikipedia page kind of like, I guess, kind of emotionally graffitied. People say bad things about you when you go contrary to the current narrative. And, I'm trying to be uh, I think a fair-minded observer of the scene. I have my certain biases. I think everybody does. I think people bring their own viewpoint to any given subject, and I think at base, humans. We see it in say football, whether it's American football or European soccer. We see people, kind of group according to allegiances, and um, sometimes that team allegiance, kind of trumps anything else. If your team cheats, gets kind of a call, you don't necessarily turn it down. You're very happy to see your team win. I think we've turned into that a fair amount politically. And if you're on a given team, that team can do almost anything before you will call it out and reprimand it and so forth. And I think what we're seeing today, writ broadly, is kind of an allegiance to progressivism. And it's okay when your group riots. It's not okay when the other one kind of gathers. It's okay when your group is doing the locking down. It's not okay when the other one's group is theoretically going to challenge you, and so forth. It becomes very kind of team oriented. Um, and we saw this clearly with the original approach to the vaccine, um, and um, the the way that candidate Joe Biden and candidate Kamala Harris were very tentative, and were thinking they wouldn't take the vaccine because it was a Trump vaccine. Now it's not a Trump vaccine anymore, and frankly, if people on the left wanted this vaccine to be better accepted, they would engage Mr. Trump, who has taken the vaccine, mind you, I think somewhat ill-advisedly, because he had already had the coronavirus, and I think there's a special category. We, frankly, need to be subcategorizing much more in a finer way, in a refined way, to make distinctions. We do this in every walk of life. We don't just, pay our taxes. We kind of subdivide. We put things in categories. We get our deductions. We try to look for every, kind of instance that you can. I have this on my mind because I'm doing my taxes by extension currently, and it's not your taxes. It's not even my taxes from last year. Things change moment to moment as far as your tax approach, and there's no reason to think that one tax form, would be great for everybody. I mean, maybe you could do a flat tax, fine, but this doesn't happen for anything else. And all of a sudden, everybody's supposed to take a vaccine. This has just never really been the case. And I mentioned on other shows, and I'm referencing them kind of liberally, um, there are many other vaccines out there. So if you're really pro-vaccine, you should get them all. I mean, there's Pokemon. It's like, why not catch? I don't know, catch them all. I guess that is the phrase. My kids did Pokemon. Um, get them all. There's various hepatitis vaccines you could have. There's I think yellow fever has a vaccine. There's shingles vaccine. There's pneumococcal vaccines. There's a whole bunch of them, and you don't have them all. I'm guessing you don't have them all. I'm pretty much as pro-vaccine as it gets. Medically, I personally have gotten the flu shot every single year, easily for maybe 35 years at least, maybe 40 years in a row, and never miss it. And So I like vaccines, and when I've had to do other kind of interesting travel, I looked into the appropriate vaccines for those travel areas, tropical countries, and so forth. And I used mosquito netting when I was in Costa Rica. I understand there are things out there, and I'm not an anti-illness person. I'm not anti-vax, but you have to have the right circumstance for the right problem. Um, and the right response. And as it is, COVID is really a biphasic virus in a sense. It's really only one virus. It's a same size and shape as a cold virus, but it does different things for old people from what it does for young people. So young people, frankly, are always better off in this particular illness, not for every, dealing with it in a natural way and just taking it as it comes. And the mortality fatality rate for young people, elementary school, middle school, high school, is essentially zero across the board. I forget the number of tens of millions of it depends where you put the cutoff, but I think minors in this country number, I think something around 60 70 million. There have been essentially zero deaths for people who don't have lymphoma, leukemia, morbid obesity, cystic fibrosis, and so forth. So if your kid is reasonably young and healthy, you're much better off getting the illness. And natural immunity is a far more comprehensive immunity than one that you get from just one protein. And frankly, that protein has changed somewhat as the variants have come out. So if they really wanted to stay up on board and make a better, more convincing argument um, for vaccines, they would modify them, because frankly, it's not that hard to do. I mean, it's hard to do. It's nothing I can do in my own kitchen. But if you're in the business of making mRNA vaccines, you can alter the genetic code, and you can have them kind of alter to keep up with the variant strains. That being said, I think that the vaccines are very, very useful for people for whom they are very, very useful, but they're not very useful for those people for whom it is not. Um, Fair tax. Uh, and yeah, that was referencing the taxes. Yeah, that would make it easier. And if we had, kind of a fair approach to vaccines, somewhat like the fair tax, still, 17-year-olds and 15-year-olds wouldn't be paying that tax, and nor should they be paying the tax on our politics, because basically that's what this is. This is a tax on our political kind of debate. And so it was all, everyone's like, oh, no vaccines, Trump vaccine. And now it's, oh, yeah, we have to have the vaccine. Everyone has to have it. And they're not even going to list, Mr. Trump to do it. And then they let people across the border who don't have the vaccine, the Haiti immigrants and whatnot. I think they're 1% vaccinated or less. About 10% are coming off over the border as carriers of the illness. If you care that much about it, you would not have an open border. I mean, of course, it's absurd. And, to have vaccine passports here and there, and then have an open border is it's a lunacy. Anyway, so I am going to spend a good part of tonight's show, and I recommend you really stick with this. And again, maybe come back to it here and there if you don't want to watch the whole thing all at once, and or look at and download his slides yourself. How do you know they're important? I think they're getting knocked off Twitter. They're probably getting knocked off Facebook. He is on Gab, Gab, and his name's easy to spell and remember and find out. His name is Steve Kirsch. He's not a physician. He's not a medical doctor. He's not in medical research or in any way. He made his name and his fame and his fortune in the, I guess, computer world, broadly speaking. I think he's one of the inventors of the optical mouse. I have not one with this computer. Well, actually, I sort of do with this computer. They're wonderful. I remember the trackball mice or mouses. And so he justifiably did well in the world. And he's an MIT guy, double MIT. I think he's got a Bachelor of Science in, I'm not sure which kind of engineering it is. You have to go check yourself, and a master's as well. My experience, he's about 60 years old. In my experience, for gentlemen coming from MIT in that generation, is if they have engineering degrees, they had to work to get there. They had to work while they're there, and they've worked since. And clearly, he has and does. And if you don't like his math, so forth, dispute it. And he has a standing offer. So anybody listening to this can make $1,000 an hour to debate him. And he has a standing offer for all the people flame throwing at him to debate him, and he'll pay you to do it and prove him wrong. And so I don't see, why you wouldn't want to do that. I frankly would like to have him on the show. I don't know if I'd get $1,000 because I'm not really, I'm in partial agreement with him. I think there's a huge reason to look carefully for certain cases when you're going to do the vaccine. In the instance, I do think there's a very clear-cut example of people who have already had the illness. Should they um, get the vaccine? And the answer probably is no, because they have immunity. So they're going to have more of a reaction to that vaccine. I was just in the my tennis club and talking with some people in the locker room, some older guys and whatnot, and they're getting their third shot, and wives and so forth. And pretty much across the board, they've had all more reaction to this version, including fever, chills, aches, and that kind of stuff. Sometimes their wives and whatnot. And not any of them had any reactions before. This is anecdotal. This is not data. I'm putting a disclaimer out there, but that is the case, that people have had more reactions to the third one amongst my friends and families and so forth. And this is, again, skews older. The older people have had it more than younger people. So read into that what you will. But I mean, what I read into it is they already have immunity to this thing that's being injected into them. They're appropriately getting a reaction to it. So did they need to get that third one? Probably not. That seems to me that is pretty indicative that they have an ongoing immunity to that thing that you are re-injecting. Now, if you, again, you wanted to make the third booster into something new, maybe more for the, some different protein, not just necessarily the spike protein, or some um, new version of the spike protein, and the so-called delta or epsilon, whatever variants coming along, well, fine, but that's not what happened. So doing this right now in this particular instance is sort of meaningless. Anyway, I'm going to try to move along, and there are things in which parts of this I agree, and parts with which I disagree from what Mr. Kirsch is doing. But frankly, overall, I applaud it, because this is part of what people call it democracy, but I call it, constitutional republic with, democratic turning points in part. But it requires intelligence. It requires free debate and conversation. If if something is worth being out there, it will be confirmed. I got to just, we had the Boston Marathon late this year because of COVID. I think they skipped last year entirely, and this year they postponed it because Delta showed up. Again, not in Massachusetts. There was really been like almost zero deaths across the board, considering that people do die every day. I think 300 people die on a normal day, in 2018, whatever, in Massachusetts, given the population. And, a handful are dying supposedly with, but maybe from or with coincidentally with COVID or whatever. But we never get the stratification. We don't get the ages and all that kind of stuff. Very difficult data to read. I think that's disappointing, given the the amount of money and time we're spending in this whole thing. We get very little stratification of the data. Anyway, speaking of the Boston Marathon, going back 2013, that was the time Dzhokhar Tsarnaev and his brother, I think Tamerlan Tsarnaev, blew people up at the finish line. They had those pressure cooker bombs, and then the thing was to find them. The police did their efforts, and they work for the government, and they have their databases and all that kind of stuff. They're not really the ones who found them. They were found through crowdsourcing this 4chan, and using various disparate videos that were from private businesses and so forth, up and down the back bay of Boston, and they found them through that method. And then people back and forth, they were doing photo identification. There was more than the police could do, and they did this. Basically, I'm not sure the number of minions, and whether in the hundreds or thousands of people who all had their own computer savvy, and they were doing facial recognition and following the people through the crowd before and after and so forth. And that's basically how they found the Tsarnaevs. And this was not done through the equivalent, the police equivalent of the CDC. This was done kind of on a molecular, crowdsourced basis. And a lot of the information that people are going to find useful is along that same way. And I think this is what's really important about Steve Kirsch's work here. First of all, it's mathematically thorough. I think there are some points at which his viewpoint and my might diverge a little bit, but I think it's really useful to look at. So let's head to it right now. And he is not modest about this. All you need to know about COVID vaccine safety. And frankly, I don't know if this will be shareable on Facebook and whatnot, but this is something you should check out. His website here is skirsch.com, but he's also at a thing called treatearly.org. and he has the email address here right here if you want to contact him or ask in any way. So I'm going to see if I can make this a little bit bigger for us and use it full screen. Let me just make sure I am on it. Yep. So there we go. So executive summary. So his basic point is the vaccines are dangerous in some way. At this point, they're killing more people than they save. We can show this 8 different ways. Again, I recommend you stop this slide. I'm not going to read everything on these slides. But you may stop at any point, just like when I do chess puzzles, and look this over and spend the time on it that you want, and or pull it up yourself. So the elephant in the room, the vaccines are killing more people than they're saving. I'm not going to go over his math. I think there are some issues with this because at this point in the epidemic, pandemic, whatever you want to call it, we have already kind of pushed aside, the people who are most apt to die because they have died, the nursing home kind of quality or lack of, kind of quality of life patients, and some similar who have been vaccinated. And so they are kind of out of the ballpark. I think this is more according to the younger cohort that's being vaccinated now. And he points here that nobody wants to debate, as I mentioned, and nobody's been able to attack his data. And the vaccines are more dangerous at certain age groups, and the danger differs per age group. So this ratio over here is higher for younger people. So he's talking about the killed versus saved ratio. Again, I recommend you look over his data and how he determines these. I think it's reasonably comprehensive at the very least. And not only just killed, but some, what he's calling permanently disabled. I think it's a hard thing to parse in a large population because the data is coming in. It's some things that happen. It's hard to do, full analysis of that, if that thing or that problem or that death happened because of the thing prior. So it's called the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, after something, therefore because of something. And these are difficult to determine unless you have, say, forward-looking studies and or you get to really parse the data more thoroughly, perhaps, than we are even seeing through our own CDC and so forth. So this is, I respect this. This is very standard for the reports of death. According to the VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Event Response System, I think it is. That's our national vaccine database of problems. And through the years, this is pretty much probably all mostly flu vaccine. These are the number of reports of death. The reports of death have gone up. Now, this is, this would in a sense be excusable. Let's say smallpox came along. We had a smallpox vaccine, which is far more dangerous, but smallpox itself, let's say, is, we'll just put a guess on it, maybe 50 times more dangerous than the flu. So if you had a vaccine that was only, 5 times more dangerous, then you would still want to take it because that is, it's a cost benefit, not against the flu over here, but against smallpox. Now, the question is this danger, if in fact these numbers are reasonable, and if, frankly, it's hard because these are just reports, they're not all verified. Is that a reasonable thing for COVID? Well, I think still it is for the older age groups, but not for the younger. And then the FDA, he retorts, says these are all background deaths. That is to say that they're happening just because people happen to be dying and they happen to be taking the vaccine. So you're, again, doing the fallacy I mentioned, which is after something, therefore because of something. But what he's showing here is that the deaths congregate more in the soon after your vaccine time, or I presume booster. So this is not just these deaths here would be maybe more on a random basis. You wouldn't be able to attribute it, but there's more of a cluster of deaths around the time of vaccine. Now, again, that isn't necessarily always because of the vaccine. It could be that people are getting sick and they want the vaccine. They're at the hospital and getting the vaccine. So it could be that you have a case, kind of a case selection bias, that people like, kind of a deathbed confession. I am ill. I want to get the vaccine right away. I don't want to get COVID. Or I just got diagnosed with leukemia. I want to get my vaccine. So it could be that the cases are different underlying. So that's just something to pay attention to over time. But given the data, it is curious and puzzling. I'm not going to spend time on this case here. This is kind of a complicated slide. I recommend you look at it. Um, and these as well. So I'm going to go kind of through this. The vaccines, so they changed the story. So this is like the story to take the vaccine. The vaccines help prevent you from dying if you get infected. But that's not true if you're under 50 years old. And I agree with this. I'm not saying I'm not going to answer to this data here because I haven't had a chance to really look at this on my own. But I think that, the certainly under 25 years old, the data are such that you have higher problems in general from the vaccine than from the illness. Myocarditis comes more from the vaccine to young men than it does from the illness. And again, the mortality is essentially zero for everybody young and healthy. You can stop these slides whenever you want. I'm not going to go over Malaysia because I'm not an expert on Malaysia right now. And there's actually 137, actually 150, probably 130 actual slides in here. So we're not going to be able to do the whole thing here. But he's making some real interesting points. Let's see if I can skip to one. Um, didn't anyone do the math? And he's going to talk about Pfizer's study of the vaccines. And I had Brent Kiewit-Kyler on, I think, 2 weeks ago. And I recommend you go look at his video because he covers something very similar to this, whether the studies were factual and whether they were organized correctly and whether there was some hole in the study where people, had, kind of a selection bias, case selection issue with the way the studies were put out. And let's see. So this is something of a let's see. I'm going to maybe pull away from this a little bit because this is a lot of information to take in. So he's confrontational in a sense. How do we know for sure that the CDC is lying about the risks? He brings up a Dr. Peter Schirmacher at in Germany, University of Heidelberg, a pathologist, and points out the kind of increasing number of people dying within 2 weeks, such as that earlier chart from the vaccine. So these are kind of more anecdotal studies in a sense, and just the fact that they're peer-reviewed scientific literature doesn't necessarily make them valid. But there are stories and talk in the kind of medical research world about this one size fits all. Like here, why are we vaccinating children against COVID-19? In plain English, people in the 65 plus demographic are 5 times likely to die from the inoculation as from COVID under the most favorable circumstances. This doesn't really relate to this slide here, but in general, the death rate is so low for children from COVID, they should not get the vaccine. It's more dangerous than the illness. And plus, again, the illness confers better immunity than the vaccine ever can or will. Here he goes into a thing called URF, which is the underreported factor, that even on the VA-ERS, there might be more cases than are showing up because people don't necessarily want to be the ones pointing out how, the vaccine's imperfect, because that kind of is considered a thought crime in a way, and it puts you on the wrong side politically. Here he goes to Australia, showing more deaths from the vaccines than from COVID. Again, you can kind of poke holes potentially in some of these slides because, Australia has tried to keep COVID out from the island nation continent entirely, and I don't know what their actual overall immunity is. So they may not have that many COVID deaths to begin with, and they're probably getting some with or coincident to the vaccine. Anyway, but the point is made here. There's some other, again, these are incidental factors, not necessarily, not necessarily, I guess, dispositive one way or another, but teen deaths are up 125% higher than the 5-year previous average since they started to be given the COVID-19 vaccine. Now, that could be from other things as well. I mean, there's a lot of, diseases of despair, heroin addiction, drinking, People are doing crazy things. There's more violence. Our society's gotten more dangerous. Things have deteriorated across the board. And leaving aside the virus, to look only at the virus, I think, is very short-sighted. Um, and again, he gets pretty complicated here. He talks about people making kind of light of the VAERS, the vaccine response system, but you can't have it both ways. You can't eat your cake and have it. And of course, you can have your cake and eat it, but you can't eat your cake and have it. So some people who are looking, to some of the same studies as bolstering their case don't like it when it doesn't. There's some nursing home cases. Again, these are anecdotal, but people are noticing something. Is there smoke, and fire at the same time? I don't know. So he quotes a lot of people who have noticing, people dying at higher rates around the time of vaccine. So I don't endorse this per se, but I think there's things to look at. I think the real message and issue here is what's kind of being kept away, and the fact that we don't see better parsed data. We see better data coming from England and coming from Israel even, um, than we see from our own country. And that's not good. We have the money to do this. We have enough people. If you ever go to DC, you see these agencies are enormous. I assume the CDC, I've never set foot there, but they're spending enough of your money, and I'm paying tax right now. I know enough of my money to be able to do this. We should have more transparent data about who's dying, what are the age groups, what are the coincident illnesses and so forth, and what are the timing after vaccination. There's no reason to just push people into this. And then he brings up some examples in India. We'll try to get to that later, but first he talks about whether the Pfizer study initially was trustworthy. And again, this is something that we covered 2 weeks ago. The possibility that the numbers don't really add up as far as the number of deaths, which should have been higher based on just regular background population. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this. It's really too hard to look at. There's some issues about people having problems. Again, it's hard to make sense out of the when there are hundreds of millions of people getting this to look at any individual case per se. But such as it is, there are I think it's fairly well founded that there are higher cases of myocarditis from vaccines, and again, particularly in younger men. So again, this is more anecdotal data. Higher rates of cancer. This is again, it's hard to prove this as it relates to the virus or the vaccine, either one, because there was a lot of postponing of treating people in the year prior. So the fact that we might be seeing more cancer this year might be case finding because people found fewer cases the year before. There's a lot to go through again here, and he's bringing up other problems. I think it's hard to believe all of this is essential to the argument, but I do think that it is, again, fascinating, interesting, the way this kind of speech is being closed off and people don't want to debate it in a regular, normal way. I think that's the thing that you should be paying attention to. And he mentions here that in other cases, we have held up when there's something amiss. So the FDA and the CDC are very, very cautious. If you remember back, I think it was in the 70s, the swine flu. Here we go, 1976. We halted the swine flu vaccination nationwide after just 32 deaths. And there were issues also of Guillain-Barré, which happens with infectious illnesses as well. So I think that's kind of a neutral point. But the point here is that we were much more cautious than we are now. And why is that? So I'm only up to slide 67. I'm actually going to take a break from this for a little bit because I need to take a break from looking at slides, and maybe we can just go over some of the take-home messages that he brings up, and I think such as they are these that there's really debate is being stifled. That should always be a sign that there's problems. We should never have really been giving, I don't think, vaccine at all to young people unless they have comorbidities, including morbid obesity and things of that sort, or severe asthma and whatnot. But your regular kids who can do athletics and whatnot, they should not have been getting the vaccine at all. There's no real need for it. We shouldn't be giving vaccine to people who already have the illness. Their immunity is complete. We shouldn't be doing this as some kind of exercise just to see what we can do. And again, the whole thing has an absurdity when we have an open border and people from Haiti, for instance, at a 1% vaccination rate are coming through. Um, and we all have to be vaccinated. This is really wherein the citizenry of the United States is kind of being treated, as second-class citizens when non-citizens are given first-class status. Housing, stipends, and whatnot, and free entry, and no care for their own vaccine passport or any passport at all, for that matter. So I might need to do like a second session to catch up on this, because there's a lot more that he brings up. Let me just see if I can find some of the interesting parts right off the bat. He brings up that there have been some um, kind of like public actions against the vaccine. Certain countries have tapered off the usage and stopped usage for children. I think the Scandinavian countries, Iceland in particular, halted vaccinating children. I think Israel went down in dose, and they went down a number of vaccine episodes that are necessary in order to have your green card or whatever passport there. Um, and then we're also seeing some, kind of admissions about some of the other aspects. In this is not really about vaccine, but the kind of the breakdown in social order, such as we're seeing in Australia and other countries where people are doing these mandates. So I think it's a big issue about why the mandates are happening, and what is the political motivation behind it. This is a hint, perhaps, that I don't. There's again one case. A woman was being in Australia was being blackmailed by quote unquote big pharma to impose COVID-19 vaccine mandate. I don't know what that. I haven't read the story, but everything here is hyperlinked, and I recommend you check it out. There are other groups as well that are doing this. We're familiar now with the pilots at Southwest Airlines had a work stoppage essentially. They don't really want to be mandated in anything. A lot of them, again, if you've had the illness, it's kind of an absurdity, and if you're young and healthy, it's an unnecessary thing. So I'm going to kind of go around maybe I'm already around the bend, but I'm going to try to go around the home stretch here and see if I can capsulize some of this for you and figure out how to come to a conclusion about this. So let's see. Well, maybe I'm going to switch gears a little bit and just talk about ex-Boston Celtic Kyrie Irving. He's in the news right now. He's a member of a team, and I listen to some sports radio, and I'm a basketball fan, and I watched him play here, and he left for the bigger spotlight in New York City, sort of his hometown from New Jersey and whatnot. And he's making money there too. I mean, he could have done that anywhere. And so they have their own super team. The New York Nets are, I think, favored, the top favorite to win the championship this year. And one Kyrie Irving won't announce his vaccine status. He says it's a private matter, but clearly the NBA is draconian about this. I'd like to point out that they've had, I don't know what fraction of the league has had the actual illness prior to the vaccine. Probably 30-40% of the league had absences during the the first year pre-vaccine, and nobody nobody stopped anything. They might have taken some time off not to be around other people, but everyone came back as good as new. I don't think there's a single player that had any deleterious effect, any severe problems from COVID itself. The whole league went on as normal. And again, these are young, healthy guys, and this frankly is healthy as you can get, strong, jump high, and all that kind of stuff. No problems with the illness. I don't see, if you're, depending on your career for physical prowess, why you'd want to risk getting a myocarditis or any other, kind of muscle problem or whatever, from, an injected spike protein, when frankly, the odds are you've already had the illness, been exposed to it, because all the guys were hanging out and doing parties and whatnot, even when they were supposed not to have done that. And I'm fairly sure, I know his teammates Harden and Durant had the COVID already, the illness, and I'm pretty sure Kyrie did as well, because he was out simultaneously with Durant at that time last year. And I don't respect Kyrie Irving for everything he says and does. I think he's kind of an odd bird, but sometimes we need odd birds, and I respect that he's holding to his guns. We'll see how long this lasts. It was interesting because part way along, um, New York City, he's having this problem because of Mayor de Blasio, in a sense. New York City has made this kind of vaccine passport, and some people call it kind of a new apartheid, because blacks, for their own reasons, maybe it's a little bit of paranoia or unsurety about whether the government means well for you, not necessarily a bad reflex, are the least vaccinated ethnicity in New York City and across the country. I think only 28% are. And Kyrie Irving is, African American, but I don't think that's his motivation per se. I think he just is that guy who likes to do things his way, and he reads on his own. And he's dances to his own tune, or a different drummer, and that's that. And there's, he's not suffering health wise, and I don't think any of his teammates are. They're all vaccinated and they're all young. But the NBA, despite the fact that nobody had any problems from the illness itself, and they're probably all immune for it, they're just, they have to be part of this greater political movement, and they're choosing sides. And there's kind of like a huge drowning out of any, counter narrative. And so I applaud Kyrie Irving. So he actually seemed to have gotten the city to back down, because they were not going to let him practice his own private facility. Then they weren't going to let him play at the Barclays Center or Madison Square Garden when they play the Knicks in New York City, because New York City is New York City, and New York City was going to New York City. It's a lunacy. People are gathering together, vax or unvaxxed, at these huge football stadiums, and we're living in two realities. I mean, people are cheek by jowl at stadia and arenas all around the country, and there have been no, increased blips, augmentations in numbers of illness or deaths and so forth in those places. So, and the Northeast had its, huge problem in early, in the spring 2020, and they've done fairly well since then, even through Delta. They did far better than the places that had, less of a first wave. So I think, methodologically, Kyrie Irving's fine. He's already had the illness, no doubt, some doubt, but probably, I say 89% he's already had the illness. He, runs on his body. His body is fine tuned. He's probably the best dribbler I've ever seen in my life. He's a very, tricky guy. And why would you want to mess with that? I mean, along those same lines, his point, why would you want to mess with that? I mean, he hasn't stated it, is the same thing with kids. They do fine. Kids do not get ill from this. Why would you mess with their own natural immunity? And this is happening all over the world, that kids do just fine with this. And why would you want to screw around? Anyway, I probably going to call it a night for this. I could go over some other details. Maybe I'll, if I get lucky and have Mr. Kirsch on the show, we can have probably a multi-part show with him. I don't know if he's, probably a little too busy for us per se, but I would love to do that. And or anybody who wants to discuss it. I can't offer you $1,000 to debate me or him, but I'm certainly happy to hear from you with any questions or objections and so forth. If you think I've misstated any facts along the way, please let me know. Just as a personal plug, I just finished my Zika book, and I am happy to, kind of give advance copies to people who are interested. I'm happy to have you take a look at it, and if you have suggestions about where it might be published, I would really like that. Zika, just to remind, was 2016's epidemic in Brazil, and billed as a pandemic. In order to be a pandemic, you have to be worldwide. Certainly, the warning was worldwide. The travel issues and the after effects of Zika's microcephaly scare were kind of spread worldwide. the panic was, but the illness, I think, is a dud. Nobody has backed down from it. Nobody's retracted from it. I have a separate page called Zika Remembered, and that's the name of the book for now, at least the working title. I think it debunks all three legs of the Zika microcephaly theory, epidemic, pandemic, narrative, whatever you want to call it. And those three legs are that Zika, which had never been an illness everywhere, anywhere on Earth through its, maybe 65, 70 years of being known at least, all of a sudden that was an illness, and it showed up in Brazil. It never been in Brazil, never caused human illnesses anywhere on Earth, anywhere on Earth. So that's part one. I think I sort of, pretty well debunked that it probably is still not a human illness. Number two is that there was a rash of microcephaly in Recife, Brazil. This was unproven. There was no comparison data, and I go through a lot of that stuff. You'd have to read the book, but take my word for it, there was probably no increase. And even if there was a slight increase, it was not really noticeable, and no particular kind attributable to a single cause. And part three is that one caused the other, that this brand new Zika caused this brand new microcephaly. Why it had to be Zika that did it, I don't know. But this is really the constituents of the book, and I think that is fairly well disproven by the intervening years. We've been around 5 years since then. There's been no rash of microcephaly. There were predicted to be millions of microcephalic babies per year. At the time, and again, it's kind of a long closing, but at the time, there were articles, not to spread any misinformation about Zika, because we didn't want to upset the Zika narrative. If you did, then lives would be lost. And everyone had to do what the public health people were saying. Some of them wanted to have people to stop having babies completely throughout Latin America and potentially throughout the tropical world. Stop having babies because, maybe 1% or 2% or something like that. If there was Zika in the first trimester, 1 or 2% of those babies, maybe 3%, could potentially be microcephalic, and some of them might potentially have mental retardation. And so, the orders for you that come up from on high are, and frankly, a little bit high themselves, and not in a good way. And so, it's important, not necessarily with your diet, but with these, pieces of information, to take with a grain of salt. And frankly, you can take most everything with a grain of salt, because a lot of that's been debunked as well. That's a separate story. But this thing where you can't eat salt, that probably doesn't affect your diet either. The book covers a lot of that stuff. If you have any ideas about how to get published, popularized, or looked at, or whatever, or people, please let me know. That would be a big help to me. And if you want to talk about anything else, let me know. I'm here until I'm not, and I'm going to be not here in about 3 seconds. Let's see.